from the heart of where innovation, money, and power collide. In Silicon Valley and beyond, this is Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang.
Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, COVID cases rise and return to office plans fall. How companies from Wall Street to Silicon Valley are doing an about-face on RTO timelines. Plus, Meta says it's cracking down on companies that have used Facebook and Instagram to spy on users in over 100 countries. We'll talk to a top Facebook security executive about the burgeoning surveillance for hire industry this hour. And Senator Jon Ossoff joins us exclusively to talk about how Georgia landed Rivian's $5 billion new factory. We're going to get to all of that in a moment, but first let's get a look at the markets where tech led the losses. Our Kriti Gupta here now with details. Kriti, take it away.
Yeah, Emily, red on the screen, a risk-off session, no doubt about it, but really a lot of pain when it comes to the tech space. And you can really see that here, the S&P 500 closing down 0.9%. Compare that to the NASDAQ, though, 2.5% worth of declines. And really, to just sum it all up, you really see those yields coming down in the Treasury market as well, alongside that risk-off mood in cryptocurrencies as well. And the big question here is, why is tech selling off so hard? Well, first off, we're low on volume. We're also dealing with some rebalancing flow. So end of month, end of quarter, end of year. Remember what has performed well in 2020 and 2021. It's going to be tech. So a lot of those flows are being reversed. But of course, at the end of the day, everyone's asking, how is tech reacting to the Federal Reserve in particular? A very kind of hawkish pivot to targeting inflation, really lowering those bond purchases. That was the message from the Federal Reserve yesterday as well. And you start to see yields tick higher before reversing. And tech actually, as they've priced in that Fed action, which is what this kind of blue line is showing here in those 2-year yields, tech has actually held steady. And that's going to be key, Emily, because earlier this year, when yields went higher, when inflation was being priced in, tech was getting spooked and tech was selling off. And now tech is actually moving in line with yield. So if yields come down, tech comes down too. And that was really the story of the day today. I want to end here with some of the subsectors of technology, because it wasn't just the NASDAQ that had a brutal day. You can see it in the semiconductor index as well, down 4.3% on the day, along with all of the other tech subsectors, Emily.
All right, Kriti, thanks so much. Meantime, plans to return to the office in 2022 are slowly taking a turn as a new wave of COVID-19 upends business plans from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Apple and Alphabet's Google have indefinitely put off their return to office dates. Citigroup told staffers in New York City to work from home through the holidays if they're able to, and Citadel issued similar guidance. Bloomberg's Sridhar Natarajan here with more now. Sridhar, talk to us a little bit about what's happening across corporate America and especially in New York City, where we're seeing another wave.
Unfortunately, it's deja vu all over again. Just now, the New York State authorities announced that we've had 18,000 new cases. That's pretty much close to its all-time high. So it's very clear that the next few days and weeks are going to get progressively worse. And we're already seeing the ripple-through effects and how it is going to affect everyone's return to office plans. Remember, New York City, the hub of finance, where the leaders of this industry have been particularly militant and hardline about the desire to see their office towers buzzing again, wanting to stock their skyscrapers again. But their desires are not going according to plans. And even as they've had people come back in, they've now been set up with having to deal with employees who are anxious again, who are nervous again and wary again. And in many cases, they're having to send people back. You've got pockets of outbreaks across various firms, whether it's banks, hedge funds, or any other firm in the city. And now the leadership has to come out and react. It started with canceled holiday parties, has moved on to, delaying through not wanting them to be back in the office through the end of the year. And some of the folks actually delaying it further out into the new year.
Talk to us about some of the stalwarts, though, folks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, where, David Solomon and Jamie Dimon have been, really adamant that folks are coming back to work, coming back to the office, while we see Apple and Google in Silicon Valley not given a return to work date at all. Are you seeing the banks that have, sort of been leading the charge on the return to the office relent at all?
They will have to relent, and at least at individual group levels. In fact, both these banks, we've heard groups where managers have told people on their payrolls to go back, work from home, at least for the next few weeks, and not be too public about it so that they don't want everyone else to know, because not all other groups have the same flexibility. But the two leaders you talk about, Jamie Dimon and David Solomon, they have been front and center in wanting to lead this return to office. Goldman Sachs brought all its employees back into the office in June. JP Morgan followed shortly thereafter in July. Compare these two firms to the stalwarts in tech. Apple, Google, Uber, these firms have not had a return to office. They had been thinking about early 2022, Feb, March, and even those plans have been set aside for a later date because they're all wrestling with the same idea that this pandemic is going to derail every plan that they're going to set.
Right, and even Lyft pushing back the return to work to 2023. Bloomberg's Sridhar Natarajan, thank you for that update. Now, as we mentioned, Apple is one of the tech companies making a U-turn on its return to office plan. Our Mark Gurman joins us now with more. Mark, Apple, yet another company saying, we can't give you a date just yet. What is Apple telling its employees right now, and what are they doing in stores?
Yeah, so this is the fifth delay to Apple's return to work plans. Originally, it was going to be June. That turned into September. That turned into October. That turned into January. That turned to early February. Now it's a date not yet to be determined, which is, in other words, indefinite, right? Some people believe that the return could happen by May or June. Some also believe that some teams are going to increasingly come back earlier. I know the majority of the hardware engineering office is going back into the office multiple times a week at this point. They are offering employees $1,000 bonuses across corporate employees, Apple Care support, retail, everyone who works for the company to buy work from home gear. They also have to shake up some of their in-store policies for their over 500 retail outlets. In the US, about half of their total footprint. Right now, they're requiring masks in all locations. That's a change from about only half of locations requiring masks. As of today, 4 retail stores across the US, including three retail stores in the US and 1 in Canada, so 4 in North America, have had to close due to an increase in counts of positive tests or exposures among employees, including one today in Honolulu, Hawaii.
Wow, okay. Meantime, you just reported on Apple hiring for a new office in Southern California, where the plan seems to be to take on more chip makers.
That's right. So Apple is working to open an office in Irvine. That's in Orange County. It's about an hour south of where I am in Los Angeles. That is a hotbed for talent that develops wireless chips. We already know Apple's been developing a modem that's to connect to cellular networks from the iPhone and other devices. Now we know they're also eyeing some of the supplementary parts to a modem: antennas, RFIC, wireless SoCs for connecting to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth from various, Macs, iPhones, and other devices, right? So they're looking to create the whole wireless stack to eventually shift away from suppliers like Broadcom and Skyworks. This is early stages. This is going to take a lot of time. We've traditionally seen Apple move into new areas that are hotbeds for specific types of technology, just like we saw them go into Austin before expanding their chip operations, or in Florida, or in San Diego, south of Irvine. Now we're seeing them do in Irvine as well for those wireless folks.
Apple expanding as always despite these COVID challenges. Do you think these store closures will impact holiday sales? Does it all move online, and does Apple have the infrastructure for that?
The majority of sales are already coming from online for the iPhone and the Mac, and the retail partners, the carriers, are also, where most iPhones are sold. So I don't think these individual Apple store closures are going to have much of an impact. We've also seen these individual case-by-case closures only really happening for 4 or 5 days max. What Apple does when this happens, they sort of isolate who's positive and is not positive, and they bring back the people who are testing negative in order to get operations up and running fairly quickly. The other thing I'd note is that, Apple stores are becoming like Starbucks. Like, I know in Los Angeles, within 5 miles from me, there is probably 10 or more Apple stores. So if one of your retail stores is closed, there are a bunch of others in most of these areas to go to.
Okay. Mark Gurman, as always, in LA. Thank you. Well, in developing news, General Motors has announced that Dan Ammann will be leaving its self-driving subsidiary, Cruise. Ammann has been CEO of the autonomous driving division since 2019. Cruise president and CTO Kyle Vogt, who was also the co-founder of Cruise before GM bought it, will serve as interim CEO. GM says along with the leadership change, it'll continue to accelerate its autonomous car plans and look into markets beyond ride sharing and delivery. Coming up, surveillance for hire. Meta says companies around the world are using Facebook and Instagram to spy on its users. We'll speak with Facebook's head of security policy about the growing hacking for data industry and how it can be stopped. This is Bloomberg. Meta says it is cracking down on companies that have used Facebook and Instagram to spy on users in 100 different countries. The company came out today with a report on their months-long investigation into what they call surveillance for hire and called on governments to step in. Joining me now, Facebook's head of security policy, Nathaniel Gleischer. Nathaniel, good to have you back here on the show. What do you mean by surveillance for hire, and how does this industry operate?
This is a global industry of a whole series of companies operating around the world that build tools to target, to hack into people's phones and to surveil them online, to spy on them online, and then they sell them to whoever wants to buy them. Their targeting is indiscriminate. We've seen them target journalists, politicians, human rights activists, and ordinary everyday citizens. And they're also targeting across the internet. Facebook and Instagram are one piece of this, but we're seeing them target dozens of platforms, websites, and internet services. And so that's why we put out this report to share as much information as possible about this industry, help people understand the type of targeting out there, and empower the work from government, from civil society, and industry to hold this industry to account.
You say the spying is coming from companies in countries like Israel, India, China. Who exactly is behind this, and what are they using this data for?
So one of the interesting and really important challenges with this industry is that they democratize surveillance tools. They make it far easier to get access to the type of tools that let you hack into a phone or spy on someone than ever before. And the question is, who are their clients? Part of what this industry does is they make it hard to figure out who's behind them. We might see a firm who's behind spying on a target, but we're not necessarily going to know who hired them. This is why we enforce consistently whenever we see someone using fake accounts like this to spy on or mislead users across the internet, including on our platforms.
Now, you worked at the Department of Justice and the White House as well, and I'm curious, given your knowledge of how the government works and approaches these issues, what kind of government response you think is necessary?
So for something like this, you have to have a whole of society response. And we outline a couple possibilities in our report. And we've already seen some really encouraging statements from the United States government and from other democratic governments around the world. In fact, just in the last few weeks, about how problematic this industry is. You could imagine know your customer requirements that ensure that these firms know who they're selling to and put some guardrails around who's allowed to have access to these type of tools. You could imagine sanctions. You could imagine a range of other steps that governments could take.
White House Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, Ann Neuberger, had this to say about their strategy. I want you to take a quick listen.
What we do there is, via our agreements with other countries, create norms to say, here's what we expect about responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and then we work with other countries to call out activity when there is irresponsible behavior.
Nathaniel, is that the right strategy?
I think it's an important piece of the strategy, and it's been really encouraging to see calls from the United States government, calls from other governments just within the last few days on exactly this issue. What is great to see is you have that paired with work from the civil society community, incredible investigators from Citizen Lab and elsewhere that are exposing these operations, and enforcements from industry teams across different companies. When you put those three things together, you start to really put pressure on this industry and make it harder and harder for them to do the type of targeting and the type of spying that they're facilitating.
Now, Facebook has, of course, been under fire for privacy, safety, and security issues. What do you say to folks who think Facebook calling out others for surveillance and selling other people's data is hypocritical?
We've been doing this work. My team was built to tackle adversarial threat actors, people that are going to target systemically and try to mislead, deceive, or harm our users. I think there's a big difference between building a community where people can share and engage and building tools specifically designed to surreptitiously spy on people, to hack into their devices, and then selling them to whoever would ask. We're seeing very serious harms caused by these actors. And my team and other teams at other internet companies are going to continue to call them out and enforce against them as long as they're targeting people across the internet.
Right, but what do you think of the folks who say that Facebook is the adversary?
So what I would say is we've been enforcing against actors like this. My team has done more than 150 enforcements like this in recent years, where we try to expose actors that are intentionally and clearly trying to exploit users. Wherever you build a community where people can gather and share and exchange information, there are unfortunately going to be bad actors who target them. And I think we have a responsibility, others in industry have a responsibility, as do government, and incredible work from civil society to hold those actors to account.
Nathaniel, you've been in this business for a long time, and I'm so curious where you see the biggest threats in cyberspace right now. What are you most worried about with 2022, especially given the cooling relationship between the United States and China?
I think there are a lot of moving parts in the security space right now and a lot of threats out there. One thing that industries like this create, though, is they create the democratization of these threats. We've seen this in the disinformation for hire space, and we're seeing this here in the surveillance for hire space as well. Companies develop that essentially will sell these tools to anyone who wants to buy them. And that means that you have far more threat actors out there, far more governments, far more private companies, far more wealthy private individuals who can use these tools, who can target people, and who can put them at risk. And pushing back on that type of democratization, making sure that there are controls around how tools like these get used, there are limits and there are protections for people, I think is an incredibly important focus in the months and, quite frankly, years ahead.
And what are you doing at Facebook and Instagram on your end to protect your users from these attacks? Certainly there's a lot that government can do, but what more can Facebook do?
So part of this always is finding and enforcing against these companies, but enforcing isn't enough by itself. We also are continually improving defenses. So we just rolled out a new program called Facebook Protect, which we've tested in the past ahead of major elections, for example, in the United States. It's a program that increases defenses and security for users around the world. And I think users also can do a couple of things to protect themselves. One thing that we would encourage everyone to do, there is a tool on Facebook called Privacy Checkup that lets people review the privacy settings of their account and increase them to sort of limit access to some of their more sensitive information. We would encourage everyone to do that and to take similar steps on other social media sites that they're part of. Everyone should enable two-factor authentication on their accounts. That's important on social media accounts, it's important on banking accounts, but it's also important on personal email, which is where these companies often target.
All right, Nathaniel Gleischer, Facebook Head of Security Policy, thanks so much for stopping by. Coming up, closing arguments have begun in the trial of Elizabeth Holmes. We will bring you the very latest on the prosecution's last words and on what we can expect from Holmes' defense team tomorrow. This is Bloomberg. The social media platform that helped fuel this year's meme stock frenzy is going public. Reddit says it's confidentially filed for an IPO. In a funding round last summer, the company was valued at $10 billion. Reddit says it has more than 50 million daily users. And after 15 weeks and 32 witnesses, the trial of Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of the failed blood testing startup Theranos, is entering its final stages. Holmes faces 11 charges of conspiracy and federal wire fraud for misleading investors, doctors, and patients about the capabilities of her blood testing device. I want to bring in Bloomberg's Malathi Nayak for an overview on what's happened on one of the most critical days of the trial yet. Malathi, the prosecution presented their closing arguments today. The defense has just started presenting their closing arguments. Let's start with the prosecution. What did they focus on today?
U.S. prosecutors today told the jury that Holmes chose to deceive and defraud investors and patients when a startup was running out of funds between 2013 and 2014. And they also told the jury that they had presented extensive evidence that shows how Holmes' brazen claims to investors and business partners like Walgreens that Theranos was endorsed by Big Pharma and used by the military were untrue.
Now, this case has gone on for months. How big a risk is it that the jury has probably forgotten much of what was said in those early weeks and months, and it was the prosecution that had to start?
Yeah, so the prosecution today definitely refreshed the jury's memory. They definitely pointed out certain statements that were made by Ms. Holmes when she was at the stand, as well as damning statements, including those by former Secretary of Defense James Mattis. So they definitely did a good job today, sort of bringing the jury back up to speed on everything that had transpired in the last few weeks.
Kevin Downey, Elizabeth Holmes' attorney, is in the middle of his closing arguments right now. What does this defense have to say in this very critical moment?
So, defense attorneys have just begun presenting closing arguments, and they likely emphasize what they've consistently said throughout the trial, and that's that Holmes was merely an entrepreneur just trying to build an ambitious startup, and the fact that she failed isn't a crime. So that's the narrative presented by them, and I think they will, try to convince the jury that all she was trying to do was just build this company, and the fact that she failed wasn't essentially a crime.
So tell us what happens next. Are we expecting the defense's closing arguments to extend into tomorrow? Will the prosecution have a chance to speak again, and then the jury takes the case?
Yeah, so it's unclear now whether, Elizabeth Holmes' attorneys will continue onto tomorrow or end their closing arguments today. So we'll have to see till the end of the day. After that, U.S. prosecutors will get a chance to sort of maybe come back and say a few statements, or we'll go straight to the jury into deliberation.
All right. Well, we are going to be following it every step of the way. Bloomberg's Malathi Nayak, thank you for giving us that update. Coming up, just announced, Rivian is going to Georgia. The EV truck maker with plans to build a massive factory there. We're going to get all the details and much more in our exclusive interview with Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff coming up next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Newly listed electric truck maker Rivian came out with big news during a tough earnings report. It's first since going public. Let's get all the details with our Ed Ludlow. Ed, take it away.
Yeah, welcome to life in the public markets, Rivian. The big news being a new plant in Georgia, right? A new facility that comes online by 2024, capable eventually of producing 400,000 vehicles. 7,500 jobs. They'll invest $5 billion. Okay, that's the future. The problem being a public company is we're worried about the here and now. They are struggling to ramp up production of their marquee product, the R1T pickup. They hope to build 1,200 units by the end of this year. They're struggling to do that. They could be a few hundred short, executives said on the earnings call. Does that remind you of anything, Emily? Are you thinking about 2018 and the Tesla production hell with Model 3? There were lots of questions from analysts about supply chain. Where are the bottlenecks? What are you doing about batteries? RJ Scaringe, the CEO, said there's no systemic risks in the supply chain, but they're basically struggling with bottlenecks in specific parts. And it's that pickup truck you see on the screen. And, what do investors think about it? Well, the stock lower in after hours. So you get your headline, the new splashy factory in Georgia. That's a few years away. In the meantime, this is a slow ramp. And if you've ordered an R1T, Emily, you're going to be waiting a long time to get one.
All right. The folks who are waiting, I know, are very excited. Ed, thank you. I want to stick with that big Rivian news, the new plant they just announced they plan to build in Georgia. For more on that, I'm joined by Georgia Senator, Democrat John Ossoff. Senator Ossoff, thank you so much for joining us. I understand you were critical in convincing Rivian to build its plants in Georgia. Talk to us about how you helped align the interests of the company and the state.
Well, I got to give credit to the bipartisan state leadership to attract this investment. A big team effort and a lot of folks who deserve credit for this. I was involved earlier this year in the effort to broker a settlement of a trade dispute between SK Innovation and LG over electric vehicle battery intellectual property. And that dispute at the ITC threatened SK's $2.6 billion battery plant in Commerce, Georgia, which is the largest foreign direct investment in Georgia's history. And lithium ion batteries and heavy electric vehicle batteries being very heavy, when you have a major manufacturing facility for the batteries in your state, you're a much more attractive site for investment for the automotive manufacturers. Georgia is rapidly becoming a world-leading hub in renewable energy, clean tech, and electric vehicles. We have, as I mentioned, that battery production facility with thousands of jobs in Commerce, Georgia. A little known fact is that Georgia hosts the largest solar module production facility in the Western Hemisphere in Dalton, Georgia. That's a Hanwha Q-Cells facility. We have the Kia Motors plant out in West Point. They're adding EV lines over the next several years. And now this $5 billion investment by Rivian. Georgia will be producing electric vehicles sold across the country and around the world. And of course, with the fourth largest deep water port in the country, the busiest airport in the world, all of our logistics capacity, Georgia is emerging as a powerhouse in this sector, not just nationally, but globally.
As you said, this Rivian deal alone will create thousands of new green energy jobs. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Rivian asked for in return for coming to Georgia and what kind of incentives the state provided?
Well, I'll defer to state leaders to brief on the state level incentives that have been offered to secure this investment. My involvement really on the front end in helping to ensure that that SK Innovation electric vehicle battery production facility was not closed to make Georgia broadly an attractive site for investment in related industries and in the broader sector. Again, when you have that kind of battery production capacity in your state, you're going to attract automotive assembly. And that's what's happened here. Look, I'd also note that in the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that we passed earlier this year, there's significant investment in building out electric vehicle charging infrastructure nationwide, as well as research and development. 68 of my colleagues in the U.S. Senate, Democrats and Republicans, uniting to support that legislation, demonstrating to the country and to the world that we're still capable in the Congress of putting the national interest ahead of partisan interest. But we in Georgia are all excited by and applauding this decision by Rivian to invest in our state. We're grateful for the investment and the thousands of jobs that it will create in coming years. And also, this is an investment in our environment. This means that we're going to be able to scale our national production of electric vehicles more swiftly, deploy them more swiftly, grow that fleet more swiftly. That means we'll be able to drive down greenhouse gas emissions and meet our generational obligation to accelerate this transition to clean energy.
So what are the conditions that make Georgia attractive? And I'm curious if you think that means California, where, of course, this is was the original home of Tesla. Of course, Tesla is now moving in part to Texas. What makes California less attractive than a state like Georgia?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to sing Georgia's praises for this audience. Let me highlight again our extraordinary logistics capacity. The Port of Savannah, which right now is undergoing a significant expansion, the Savannah Harbor Expansion Project, is, depending upon how you count, the third or fourth busiest container port in the country. It's the fastest growing. It has the largest single container terminal in the country. Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport is the single busiest airport in the world. So we've got all of that logistics capacity, and we're building out logistics capacity swiftly. We have massive research and development capabilities. Georgia Tech, for example, which is leading in polysilicon research and research associated with clean energy, battery technology that produces not just the tech itself, but also a highly skilled workforce that can be involved at every step of the value chain for these companies, support with engineering, support with developing the software that powers these tools and assembly lines. And then what we're really seeing emerge in Georgia is the synergies when you get deep investment in these specialized sectors concentrated geographically. I mentioned the Kia Motors plant out in West Point. There's a whole ecosystem of vendors and suppliers supporting those activities along that I-85 corridor extending from eastern Alabama into western Georgia. When you have the battery production facility, we're seeing other suppliers and vendors emerge around commerce. The solar module production facility I mentioned in Dalton, Georgia, is rapidly growing as one of the preeminent places in the world for solar manufacturing. So Georgia has a lot to offer: a skilled workforce, great logistics, links to the rest of the world, and a concentration of firms in these critical sectors.
So on that note, I mean, what other companies are you in talks with? Do you plan to convince other legacy automakers, for example, or energy companies to make a home in Georgia?
Well, let me give you an example. I was on an official visit to South Korea a few weeks ago, meeting with Korean industrial leaders and promoting Georgia as a site for FDI. And to give you a sense of the possibilities, I've introduced the major solar energy legislation in the Senate, which will create manufacturing incentives to attract a fully integrated, vertically integrated solar supply chain to the United States, from polysilicon to ingots to wafers, cells, modules. There are billions of dollars that are awaiting enactment of that legislation, billions of dollars already on their way to the United States in the solar sector. I am making a push across the country and internationally to attract more firms to Georgia. And I would welcome interest from other automakers, and they should reach out to me in my office if you have any interest. We'll go out of our way to make the case for Georgia and to connect you with all the right players in our state to let you know what incentives are available and how you can connect with workforce, innovation, research and development, and logistics in the great state of Georgia.
Still, Georgia is no stranger to losing business over hard-right politics. How worried are you about potentially lost business over voting rights and restrictions?
Well, look, I'm very worried about the impact of these voting restrictions on the ability of every eligible voter to vote. And that's why it's vital that in the United States Senate, we restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act. That's a core legislative priority for me. My colleague, Senator Reverend Warnock, gave a powerful speech on the Senate floor yesterday calling on Congress to act. It did not used to be a partisan issue. This is the Voting Rights Act. It needs to be fully restored and strengthened to meet the challenge posed by these partisan efforts to restrict ballot access. That's an ongoing fight. It's a historic fight. I got my start in public service working as a very young man for Congressman John Lewis. It was a half century ago, but he had his skull fractured marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, daring to demand the right to vote for Black Americans in the American South. And we have an obligation, a historic obligation, to restore and strengthen the VRA and ensure that every eligible American voter has ballot access. That's why I introduced the Right to Vote Act, which would enshrine for the first time in federal law an affirmative right to vote and give any voter the ability to challenge state or local laws that diminish their access to the ballot without cause.
Will the Senate pass anything before the recess, Senator Ossoff?
Look, those discussions are ongoing and vigorous. And in fact, I'm going to leave this interview, go and vote on the floor, and jump right back into those meetings.
All right, we'll let you get to it then. Georgia Senator Jon Ossoff, thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you here on the show. Coming up, merging the physical and digital worlds at the happiest place on earth. My next guest, the founder of Lumix, is already in talks to make that a reality. That is next. This is Bloomberg. The future of the metaverse may be a whole lot closer than we realized. Amusement parks are already experimenting with it, and my next guest is working with Disney to make it a reality. Illumix, an augmented reality company, is in talks with Disney Imagineering to help create an immersive experience at Disney parks. Joining me now, the founder and CEO of Illumix, Kiran Sinha. Kiran, thank you so much for joining us. We're looking at video there of you waving to Buzz Lightyear at the park, and I'm so curious about how the technology actually works. Do we have to wear glasses to see that or look at our phones?
This is all phone-based. One of the real tenets of what we have built is making augmented reality in this digital physical metaverse not only highly accurate and realistic, but also very accessible. And so we've moved away from the model of having to download separate apps for augmented reality. And this type of technology could be injected into any app, or even in some cases, websites on the e-commerce side. And so that is a really huge part of what we have done technically from a capabilities perspective. What you're seeing there is actually real-time integration on a regular mobile device of digital and physical without pre-mapping or pre-scanning, which is something that's really not been possible, I think, until today.
So you say you're moving away from storytelling to story experiencing, but it sounds like in order to experience that story, we have to be looking at our phones while we're standing inside a theme park?
Yes, I think in that particular example, there has to be some kind of view device. And so the mobile phone is the most accessible way of doing it. And we really think about it as the same amount of effort as when you take a photo. You know, some of these parks are actually the most Instagrammed and photographed places in the world. And so people are leveraging their phones. It's a question of when they do that, can we provide an experience that creates a deeper interaction and engagement with these spaces where it's not just about where you now have the power. You as a participant in this metaverse or in this wider experience can actually change or interact and engage with these things that might not otherwise be feasible or possible, but that digital gives us. I think there's an incredible amount of power and flexibility we see in the digital world. We see this manifest, in gaming primarily, but being able to take that and imbue that in these physical experiences has, I think, a huge amount of potential and is really a window into, as glasses or as the metaverse becomes more prominent, what that world and what those modalities might be and feel like.
How likely do you think it is that brands like Disney will merge their experiences with those of other brands? Like, will I be able to jump from Magic Kingdom to Universal Studios? And if not, will the metaverse really be a place where I can experience everything on the internet?
Yeah, so I think that there's a few misconceptions about what the metaverse is, I think primarily driven by pop culture. I think the first is, of course, that the metaverse is this fully virtual world that's going to replace our physical reality. And fundamentally, at Illumix, we don't believe that's the case. We believe the real power and potential of the metaverse is in unifying the digital and the physical worlds, as you saw in those videos. And that's really what our tech enables and the types of interactions we power. I think the other part of it is this concept that all of these worlds will become completely interoperable through a single monopoly. That's, I think, a big part of how people talk about the metaverse. And fundamentally, we see the metaverse evolving more similarly to the way the mobile app ecosystem has developed, where there are going to be different metaverses, perhaps for different IPs and for different use cases. There might be a different place or way in which we work versus socialize or play. And there may actually be several versions of that pending audience. And so that's really, I think, what the future is going to look like. It's several different layers or versions of the world that we can jump in and out of.
So what do you think the biggest barrier is right now between life today and the metaverse of the future? Is it a hardware thing? Is it a product iteration thing? The fact that AR glasses don't really exist yet, or is it a software thing?
Obviously hardware and glasses will play a critical role in making this ubiquitous, but I think it's actually more around the technology and the interaction specifically. Technology has not yet been at a point at which digital physical interaction, I think, unlock real value. If you look at where AR and digital physical has had the most impact and has the highest touch with the mass market, it's inside of social networks, right? It's inside of things like Snap and Instagram, where that's become a daily use case and a daily interaction for people. It's our vision that the way this will roll out is actually creating higher quality technology that has real accuracy and unlocks that brand value, but inside of existing use cases. So for us, whether that's the existing use cases of when you physically go to an recreational environment or to a physical location, or even when you're already on a website, for example, and you're buying something in an e-commerce experience, being able to inject that real meaningful digital physical interaction right near the point of purchase. I think that's what the future is going to look like, where all of these different modes will inherently have a digital physical component to it.
All right, we'll look forward to someday heading to the Magic Kingdom to check it all out. Kiran Sinha, founder and CEO of Lumix, thank you for joining us. Coming up, robotaxis take on Paris. Our conversation with the CEO of Mobileye about the company's big plans. Next, this is Bloomberg. Robotaxis are about to hit the streets of the French capital. Intel's autonomous driving unit Mobileye is launching a service to carry employees of Paris's most famous department store. While a small step, it is a big sign of robotaxi momentum, according to Mobileye Vice President Johan Jungwirth. He spoke with Arad Ladla.
Europe, in this sense, is kind of leading the way, and we expect the next step to be the European Union and the EU 27 to have such regulation. And in parallel, of course, there will be some competition worldwide, like Singapore and other markets. And we hope that the US will follow soon as well with a federal regulation. And we can definitely just recommend, regulators, legislators around the world to actually make this step and actually have a federal legislation and regulation in place.
So in terms of commercialization and the industry, you see Europe as being ahead of the United States and other regions?
So at least, having this framework, right, which is important, so that it's not like, a different, let's say, regulation in like 50 different states. So right now, what we have in the US, we have, of course, several states which have frameworks in place, but it's very different. In California versus, let's say, Texas or New York State and so on. So that's why we are very much, for federal level legislation and regulation. And therefore, I think this is important, for both for technology providers, for automotive manufacturers, as well as for consumers, because, at the end of the day, you want to be able to use, the same apps traveling, from A to B, and then be able to have access to these services. And I think accessibility is another important topic also, which will impact the design of the vehicles of the future to really have accessible services, inclusive mobility for all.
JJ, everyone I speak to around the world has the same question. When do commercial robotaxis actually become real?
So we see actually 2022 till 2025, this phase, the next 3 years, as actually the most important for these commercial robotaxi, robo-shuttle services. So, of course, we need regulatory approval, and there is this dependency to receive that. Therefore, basically, I expect this, to be in somewhere in 22 or latest 2023 when these commercial deployments, will start and then basically scale. From there, it's all about scaling. And Mobileye is all about safety, number one, and scaling, number two. Everything we do is about scaling and safety, and I think this is key to success.
So let's bring this full circle. How does the project in Paris help you achieve those long-term goals?
So it definitely helps us to have a full end-to-end rider experience using the Move It app, and then basically having the full A to B, ride-hailing experience with the autonomous vehicle. Now in Paris, it's still with safety drivers, and it will certainly help us, to get feedback from riders, to get experience in, one of the most complex driving environments. It's even crazier driving than New York City. When we were in New York this year, where I already thought this is the peak, but actually Paris tops that. And we have actually chosen these locations and these cities. We go to these most dense and most complex environments even first, and we think this is the right approach. And then, for example, looking at Tokyo, maybe just as another example, in Tokyo, left side driving. So that means we get a lot of experience there, for the UK, for, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. So I think you need to look at this on a global map and in a global scale.
Mobileye there with our own Ed Ledlow, and that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We will see you back here tomorrow. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg.